Welcome to the Wheel of Time Diaries, this time episode 39. I'm your host, King Crusoe, but you can call me KC, and this week is the second episode covering A Crown of Swords, the seventh book in the series. Now, over the last week, I did get exactly where I planned to last week. I talked about how I would reach chapter 18 in time to do the second diary, and that did in fact happen. You'll see the one bookmark in here is at basically the halfway point. I'm about 47% of the way through the book after 8.5 hours of reading over the last 7 days, and of course totaling now about 16 hours in the book so far, just under halfway through. Continued to really enjoy my time reading this week. It's been enjoyable for me to be able to follow along with Egwene's POV, most particularly as what the bulk of what we're going to talk about today is. I would say probably half of the chapters that we're talking about here. I think half of the chapters, if I'm not mistaken, are going to be from Egwene's POV, chapters 8 through 12 out of the chapters 8 through 17 that I read over the week. Like I said, I have been enjoying my time with the book, but I have to admit that the last couple weeks I've actually struggled just a little bit to actually meet my targets of how much I planned to read, how much I wanted to read in order to do the series. I was hoping to do 4 videos on A Crown of Swords, reading approximately a quarter of it each week, and that basically worked for these first couple weeks, especially with the way that certain POVs and storylines and stuff are kind of lining up and how things are split up within the book. It's worked so well for these first couple weeks. Unfortunately, however, probably the rest of the book isn't quite going to go at that pace. I don't think I'm going to finish the book with just the last 2 weeks that I have allotted for it. I think I'm going to be splitting that up into 3 weeks, which means that by this time next week, the third bookmark there is at chapter 28, so I expect to read probably another 10 chapters or so in the coming week, which is only about 130 pages instead of the full 160 or something that I would need to read in order to catch up properly. There was the possibility that I would try to read upwards of 200 pages to catch up and also get a little bit ahead in time for the 4th week, but I don't think that's quite going to happen. So instead, I'm going to take it slightly slower for these next couple weeks and then just tack on an extra week at the end. So if you're following along, that is the plan. I think my goal is to reach chapter 28 this week and call that good, and then we'll, reconvene next week and decide from there, or I'll make another video and talk about what I plan to get the week after that. But without further ado, this is my second attempt at this video because last night I tried recording for it was a 35-minute recording, and then I spent probably about 40 minutes here of wasted time. It turned out being a really garbage portion of the video, and it was only the first half of what I was going to talk about. And as I said, it was absolutely garbage, so not worth posting at all. Just completely decided to restart today instead. So that is what we are doing. Let's just kind of jump into things with the actual spoiler-free discussion of how I felt. I told you that I enjoyed being able to follow Egwene's POV to start with basically the first half of the reading this week, and that I've enjoyed what I read in the week, and that it holds true for the rest of what we're going to talk about today as well. More so than just Egwene's POV for the first half, we followed a decent bit of Matt's POV after that, plus a handful of other auxiliary POVs that kind of give us a little bit of extra information that support some of the events that have been happening regarding Egwene and regarding Matt as the primary perspectives that we followed over these last 150 or so pages. And it's pretty much all been really good stuff. There's some material that I haven't followed along with fully. The last chapter in particular, chapter 17, I would say a solid chunk of it flew right over my head. There was another chapter in there with some material that flew right over my head, but there was some pretty fun and interesting stuff as well. And Egwene's POV specifically had a lot packed in there, a lot of it being very political in nature. I think Robert Jordan, when he actually gets into this sort of political tension and the underlying political philosophy of characters and how to get those kind of tensions resolved and the way that characters kind of work through those issues is actually generally pretty good throughout the series. At least as far as I've read, I felt like that's been my experience. I've largely enjoyed when he's done that kind of thing, and Egwene especially is a great example of that. Me personally, I've never really struggled with Egwene's character in the series up to this point. And this book is no different. Of course, I'm going to be spoiling a portion of Lord of Chaos here, so if you haven't read that book, I don't know why you're watching this video in the first place. It'd be kind of strange. But Egwene being raised to the Amerlin seat amongst the sort of breakaway group of the White Tower, the rebels, so to speak, was a moment that I didn't quite see coming in Lord of Chaos, even though that plot point had technically been spoiled for me ahead of time. I had thought that it was spoiled for a completely different book than it happened in. And when it didn't happen in that book, I was like, okay, so that must have just been like some troll or something. And then it happened in the next book. I was like, oh, okay, that's where that came from. Either way, it still happened to surprise me. But with her being raised to the Amerlin seat, there's a lot of political stuff, especially on the side of the Aes Sedai, as you might expect, that has been really interesting and engaging to follow. And then Matt's role in the book seems to be going some potentially important directions within the series now. After Lord of Chaos, he was just kind of there. He existed, I guess, but that was about it. I would say basically all the other characters associated with Matt's portion of the plot line in A Crown of Swords are characters like I did not remember a single one of them from Lord of Chaos because of just how minor of a role that they played within Matt's POV, and furthermore, how minor of a role Matt played within that book specifically. Basically, all he did was get ordered to go get Elaine to transfer her to Camelin, and then get drug along with Elaine and Nynaeve to come down to Abu Dar, which is where their portion of the plotline this week starts off, and where we get to start to see a little bit of that actual give and take, trying to get the Bull of the Winds from them, which of course we will talk about a little bit later. But the point is that basically everything that I read over the last week has been good, and it has been engaging and also kind of refreshing. There's a sort of weird give and take that I have with POV allocation within different book series, and Robert Jordan has a very unique way of doing things in that he'll often like take one character's perspective and like follow that character for a very long time relative to most other books, and then kind of jump to another POV and do the same thing, follow for a very long time, and then he'll have like a small section where you go through like 15,000 POVs in a very short period of time, all handling a lot of probably important foreshadowing information that goes in one ear and out the other effectively, which is a tactic for sure. But Robert Jordan's handling of POV allocation as far as like actually following one character versus another for long periods of time usually tends to work for me. I would say most of the time it happens to work for me, and in this book it really has. The beginning of the book being basically just Perrin, and then having one chapter of Rand there where Perrin couldn't reasonably be in the scene, and then moving on here into Egwene's POV for a solid chunk of time, and then moving into kind of Matt's POV with some other stuff going on in the meantime, has worked for me. It's that style that Jordan does well, and which I enjoy getting to read within the series, because that particular sort of allocation style doesn't really happen in very many other series. Most other fantasy stuff that I've read personally tends to either be very regular with how it splits out POVs, or be very frantic with how it splits out POVs, and Jordan is neither of those things, and it's, you know, kind of its own form of engaging. But with all of that being said, I think that's enough like kind of preamble in this sort of spoiler-free-ish type of terrain. Let's go into the spoilers and actually talk about some of the events that has occurred. Chapter 8 is where we're going to start for the week. And of course, basically all 5 of these chapters that we're going to be talking about from Egwene's POV, as I said, is very political in nature. There's a lot of underlying things that are just happening. So there's plenty to be implied and things to be read from the events that are occurring based off of those implications. There's a lot of just stuff, information being thrown at you. Not all of it seems to be entirely important, like inherently, but that doesn't necessarily mean that very much of it is not important either. It's just kind of what I've noticed is there's a lot of information jam-packed into these Egwene chapters, little details that are kind of hard to put together and explain and summarize what's happening in the chapters because of all the little things. I discovered this last night as I recorded 35 minutes of a video just talking about Egwene's POV happenings and it being absolutely garbage, so I apologize if this video happens to be garbage in a very similar way, but I'm going to try to talk about it. Chapter 8 starts off with Egwene kind of having a little meeting of sorts with her keeper of the chronicle, Sheriam. Swan Sanche also happens to be in the room. I believe through a portion of the conversation that Egwene's servant of sorts that she was sort of assigned, named Chesa, I believe, is there through part of the conversation as well. I might be misremembering that, but there's a little bit of this sort of meeting going on between these characters. Of course, Swan was at one point the Amerlin, and Sheriam is Egwene's keeper, so there's some pretty high level stuff that is going on with these three that is more or less important to talk about. In this meeting, Egwene deals with the kind of talkings and happenings and the considerations about what these Aes Sedai, these rebel Aes Sedai, are going to do when they actually come to the White Tower, when they finally get to that point on their journey. There's some discussion about what's going to happen. No real conclusions to draw, no important plans to really discuss or to really lay out that they come to, but in the course of the conversation, even so, Egwene happens to question Sheriam about some of what she noticed as 10 Aes Sedai from Saladar when they were still in Saladar, leaving and going to the White Tower upon Elida's recalling Aes Sedai, who are faithful to her. This is a revelation that Saladar's committing some sort of plot here with these 10 Aes Sedai from, I believe, 2 from a handful of different Aja being sent to the tower, kind of undercover of sorts. Like I said, going back under Elida's command back when that happened to kind of seed a little bit of discontent, a little bit of mistrust in there with Elida within the tower itself as a sort of plot, like I said, and hope that something goes well for the rebels in that regard. That's an interesting thing to reveal here. Not sure what's going to come from that, but I'm interested in learning more for sure. During this meeting as well, Egwene also puts on the Adam bracelet that she has that is connected to Moghedien, with Elaine and Nynaeve now down in Ebu Dar and kind of away from the camp. She is the one that has the bracelet. Sheriam actually comments on the bracelet, if I'm not mistaken, says, oh, that looks like the same kind of bracelet that Nynaeve and Elaine would share between each other. And Egwene's like, okay, yeah, cool. I don't want you noticing that, and kind of tries to slough off that sort of reaction, that recognition. But putting on this Adam bracelet means that she suddenly feels, of course, as she normally would, Moghedien's feelings, a Forsaken that is on the other end of the Adam at this point. And quite fortuitous, or maybe unfortuitous timing, depending on how you see the particular situation, Egwene feels through the Adam bracelet the emotions and the power of the necklace, I guess, because on Moghedien's end it would be a necklace, being taken off of her, being released so that Moghedien is freed from this bondage, which is a very scary thing indeed, because Moghedien is of course Forsaken, but you have to remember that you can't just channel the bracelet off. I believe that's a rule. I might be totally making that up. I apologize if I'm making that up, but I guess I was under the impression that even if you can channel the bracelet off, or the necklace off rather, the person who is captive within it can't do that. We know that much at the very least. I do remember that much at the very least. But either way, Egwene is able to sense and feel through this Adam bracelet that she is freed, and more importantly that she is freed by the male half of the one true source, the male half of the power, which I believe is called Saidin, if I'm not mistaken. I often forget whether it's Saidin or Saidar that is male or female. I believe Saidin is male. I'm going to go under that assumption. If I'm getting them backwards throughout this entire video, I apologize greatly. I really am sorry. Sometimes it's hard to remember details, especially when all the details sound the exact same as one another. The point is that Moghedien is freed by the power of the male half of the one source, and Egwene is obviously not entirely sure how this was able to happen, how this came about, and recognizes the dangers of it because of Moghedien being freed. She rushes off here at the very end of the meeting, just kind of out of nowhere, pretending to be sick or some sort, because she's goes to check on Moghedien's tent, and sure enough, when she gets there, Moghedien is not there anymore. She's no longer held captive there. She's been freed. And in her reaction to this, she decides to have Chesa, her servant, who has followed her or somewhere or something like that. I believe Chesa followed her to the tent here upon her, coming. And Chesa is given orders to bring back Swan and also Leanne as the two only Aes Sedai who, other than Egwene and Elaine and Nynaeve, are aware of Moghedien and, the ramifications of all of that. When Swan and Leanne get there at the beginning of chapter 9, we of course have Egwene talking to them and telling them that, yeah, Moghedien's now free and somehow she escaped. And these two are given orders to basically give orders to somebody else, one of, like the novices or something along those lines, to figure out who was seen around the tent, who potentially could have freed Moghedien, not in quite so direct a manner, but basically, inquires just like, hey, who's kind of been around this area and that kind of thing. Following this sort of revelation, Egwene's obviously quite stressed and experiencing some tension headaches or something of the sort. This will be an important point later in just a couple of chapters. Egwene goes on a walk here in chapter 9 as a result of this frankly very stressful revelation. Along the walk, Leanne happens to be around. She talks to Egwene again at one point in the walk, and Leanne tells her basically that her desire, because she's kind of like considering things, she happens to talk out loud at one point or another, that she wants to go to Rand personally and kind of deal with him herself as the Amyrlin seat. Leanne reminds her in this scene that she can't, because Egwene, being the Amyrlin doesn't have very many laws that kind of restrict her power, can restrict what she can really do, but one of the few laws that the Amyrlin does have imposed on her, just as a rule, is that they can't really put themselves into direct danger without the full approval of all of the sitters of the hall, or some technicality along those lines. So obviously Egwene putting herself forward and trying to talk with Rand directly as the Dragon Reborn would be putting herself directly in danger, so she technically can't do that. Leanne reminds her of that. That's an interesting thing to note. I did not know that law existed. Maybe it was revealed earlier in the series, but I think I might remember that moving forward. We'll see. I probably won't. Who knows? But after this little discussion with Leanne, Egwene is also approached now kind of as in part of her walk by a novice named Nicola and a hunter of the horn named Irina. These couple girls, or I guess they're technically older than her if I remember correctly, actually. These two seem to be troublemakers, and I say that because in the scene they try to blackmail Egwene. Bold move, Cotton. Let's see how it pays off for them. It's not very subtle the way that they try to the way that they threaten this blackmail against Egwene. Apparently, these two girls were part of the kind of group on the ship that Nynaeve and Elaine were on a couple books ago or something, doing something. I believe it was when they were, kind of on the very west end of the continent, somewhere around like Tanchico or something. I might be misremembering some of that, as I misremember a lot of things about the series. But that's like the idea that they got. They were around at some point and happened to overhear Tom and Sandar, who are accompanying those two and have been accompanying those two for quite a while, actually. Overhearing these two men happen to mention discussing the fact that Elaine and Nynaeve were faking being full Aes Sedai when they weren't, and kind of like hinting and suggesting throughout this admission that they know that Egwene was pretending to be full Aes Sedai when she wasn't either. And obviously the punishment for committing such an act is relatively severe amongst the Aes Sedai. You don't pretend to be a full sister if you're not. So the fact that these three did, even though they were doing so under the orders of the Amyrlin at the time, Siuan Sanche, it would not be a good thing to just kind of get out there, be disseminated amongst the group of Aes Sedai. So they threatened to blackmail Egwene as the Amyrlin and say, hey, it would sure be a shame if somebody found out about this. Like I said, very bold move, and don't know why they decided to do that, but it's kind of crazy that they did. Moving on to chapter 10, we get a little bit of dream-related stuff from Egwene rather than being in the waking world. The chapter basically starts off with her putting herself into a dream-walking state. Of course, she is a dreamer with very rare ability amongst the Aes Sedai. She can interpret dreams. She does a little bit of this at the end of the chapter, but she learns some things from the Aiel Wise Ones as well about like touching dreams, being able to communicate with other people via their dreams to some degree or another. So by touching Nynaeve and Elaine's dreams this night, Egwene basically warns them about Irina and Nicola. She touches their dreams and lets them know that these two happen to be threatening blackmail against them, and tells them to not come back to this kind of breakaway rebel group of the Tower. I would say the Tower, but like they're not actually at the White Tower. It's kind of complicated to talk about the two groups of Aes Sedai at this point. She advises them nonetheless to not return to the rebels until they have the Bowl of the Winds. So ordering them just like, don't show your faces around here. It's too big of a risk if you don't have the Bowl of the Winds, because the Bowl of Winds is like this important artifact, this important like magical piece of something that could be very useful, and who knows, might even be able to offset like some sort of punishment that they may or may not receive if they're having pretended to be Aes Sedai is revealed at some point. Who knows? But that is something that she does. She touches their dreams and does that, and also touches the dreams of one of the Wise Ones and requests a meeting with them in Tel'aran'rhiod in doing so. And as such, the chapter moves into a scene where Egwene discusses with Melaine and Bear and Amis. No idea if I'm pronouncing those correctly. I'm probably pronouncing them very incorrectly, as would be the usual with me. She meets with them in Tel'aran'rhiod just as normal. Egwene admits to them in this scene finally that she has been made the Amyrlin seat for the rebel Aes Sedai. That is kind of why she can't really come back and train under the Wise Ones anymore, because she has her own obligation to fulfill with the Aes Sedai. So that's something that she finally admits. She also learns in this meeting that Marana, who was, if I'm not mistaken, I believe was meant to be one of Saladar's Aes Sedai, meant to be like an embassy of sorts for Rand, to basically let him know that Saladar is not inherently oppositional to him as the Dragon Reborn, that even though they're not necessarily vowing support for him, they're not vowing being against him. Apparently, I guess the Aes Sedai were kind of worrying about kind of what happened with this, what happened to Marana, whether she was going to come back or whether the message ever actually got given to Rand to one degree or another. And Egwene asks the Wise Ones about this, and therefore learns that Marana's intent at being this sort of embassy to inform Rand of their sort of neutral-ish, if you could call it that, position, that at the very least, this sort of embassy hasn't gone horribly, that it hasn't turned out with like Rand straight up turning her away or being hostile in some degree or other. So that's information that I'm sure I'll forget by the time it becomes important at some point in the future. Egwene also asks the Wise Ones as well, basically requests for them to be delicate with Rand's positioning where he is, in accordance to both the Aes Sedai and the Aiel, to kind of tread lightly in regard to the very tense political stuff that's going on with all of these various like factions, if you could call them factions. I don't think that's necessarily the appropriate term, but it's somewhere along those lines. That's the request that Egwene makes. Following this meeting with the Wise Ones here, Egwene also does some of this dreamer stuff that I hinted at before, the Aes Sedai thing, experiencing many snippets of dreams from a perspective of trying to interpret them. So there are several scenes here, some of which are made to be maybe important, some of which are made to kind of just be throwaway inherently. There's maybe some foreshadowing stuff going on in here. If there is, I am sure to forget it by the time it becomes important, like absolutely certain. I have a hard time catching foreshadowing in this series, I've noticed, because Robert Jordan tends to repeat things that don't actually really matter that much, and does not repeat things that do matter. That's been a bad habit that he has had in terms of like the repetitiveness of his prose. He says things over and over that like we've heard a million times and do not need to have repeated ever again. It's like, okay, cool, I know sort of some of the differences between the male and female half of the one source since like the Great Hunt. I don't need you to explain these differences anymore. But then things like certain foreshadowing like this could fly right over your head and like you might not even notice on a reread type of thing. Of course, I'm just making assumptions. I have no idea if any of these little snippets of Egwene's dream is actual foreshadowing, but whether or not it is, it's just kind of something that I've noticed and something that I had to laugh about. And now we move into chapters 11 and 12, going on to the next day. From Egwene's perspective, the first thing that happens in chapter 11 here is seeing Egwene go to her little study tent after awaking in the morning, encountering there a couple of Aes Sedai whom she raised when she became Amyrlin. Of course, in Lord of Chaos, when she became the Amyrlin seat, she just raised a handful of the accepted, just straight up to Aes Sedai directly, these being Nynaeve, Elaine, Theodrin, and Phelan. Of course, we can account for Elaine and Nynaeve being down in Ebu Dar, so Theodrin and Phelan just kind of happen to be in her study tent when she gets there in this morning, and it turns out that they were the ones who were kind of tasked with discovering who may or may not have been around Moghedien's tent when she was freed. And these two report to Egwene directly here that nobody was really seen or noticed by anybody who was around Moghedien's tent except for Halima, which, of course, if you recall, and this was something that I had forgotten about until like kind of offhand, because I forgot to mention this earlier, actually. I talked about this in the recording last night. I did not hear. I guess we'll talk about it now. Halima is Arengar, one of the revived Forsaken who uses Saidin and uses the male half of the One Source because in a previous life was male, but in this sort of like reviving here ended up appearing female, being basically female, but despite resuscitation or whatever, however you want to call it or describe it, still happens to use the male half of the One Source no matter what they look like now. So in this way, we've known that Halima's kind of been hiding in plain sight in Saladar for quite a while at this point. And of course, Halima was seen around Moghedien's tent, but this is a form of dramatic irony here. We, the readers, know that Halima is Arengar, but nobody else does, and Egwene especially doesn't. Again, a point that we'll come back to a little bit later. So this is a revelation for us. It's just like, okay, yeah, we know that Halima definitely freed Moghedien now, but what I forgot to talk about earlier, but which I'm going to discuss now, it turns out this was something that was actually revealed to us already before the freeing of the scene ever happened, or before the freeing of Moghedien scene ever happened earlier in chapter 8 or whenever. And that is because, and thank you to Reen for reminding me of this, I'd completely forgotten that in Lord of Chaos's like 5-page epilogue or something like that, I honestly forgot that it had an epilogue in the first place. But within the epilogue is like a page or so directly from Moghedien's point of view, which features the scene of her being freed by Halima, by Arengar. So that was something that I'd forgotten about. Again, thank you to Reen for reminding me that when I was talking about my reading for the week. That's good to know. We know that happened, and we can explain, obviously, if I'd been thinking a little bit more deeply for 5 milliseconds, I would have like remembered back when Egwene noticed that it was the male half of the true source that freed Moghedien. It's just like, okay, who could that possibly have been? I just happened to forget in that moment that Halima existed, and of course, more importantly, that the epilogue of Lord of Chaos had already shown that scene happening from Moghedien's point of view. So good to know that Phelan and Theodrin discovered or uncovered the information that Halima was seen around the tent. But that was about it. And of course, Egwene doesn't make any assumptions that Halima was the one to free Moghedien because nobody knows that Halima isn't actually a female. I guess that's just the way that we're going to describe it, to not touch on any really insensitive topics or in any insensitive ways. We're going to say that Halima is not actually a female because she uses the One Source. I'm probably going to still refer to her as she and her because I don't know, man. It's complicated. It's really complicated is what I'm saying. I'm going to refer to her as male when it comes to the magic usage, but probably use female pronouns because from everybody else's point of views, she's a woman. Nobody knows that she's not, basically, except for like other Forsaken, for example. Either way, the point is that we know who freed Moghedien. Technically, Egwene knows, but she hasn't put the pieces together yet because she has no reason to assume that that's what happened. Absolutely none at all. I don't think really anybody in this breakaway rebel group of the Aes Sedai can know unless any of them are Black Aja, and at this point I don't know if any of them are explicitly Black Aja or not. There are some of those hiding around out and about in the world, but I don't know if any of them are actually amongst this group. Interesting. Anyway, we're going to continue on regardless. Following this revelation, this information that Theodrin and Phaelin give to Egwene, they swear personal fealty to her, as for some reason, I guess, like kind of an unheard of thing to do or to say or whatever, but they swear fealty to Egwene personally, after having basically announced their kind of like disappointment. Upon giving the information about Halima and Moghedien, they expressed regret that they hadn't been able to take the three oaths through the Oath Rod, because of course the Oath Rod is at the White Tower and none of these Aes Sedai are at the One Tower, so anybody who is being raised to Aes Sedai, and most particularly the ones that Egwene raised herself, haven't been able to take the oaths or whatever. So they regret that Egwene can't trust them because they haven't been bound by the oaths and therefore can't lie. Egwene tries to, like, I guess, comfort them to some degree, or reassure them that, like, it doesn't really matter, I trust you. To some degree, I would almost trust you less if you had taken the three oaths, because everybody knows that Aes Sedai like to hide the truth in plain sight, or tell, like, little white lies, basically. Not tell the full truth, hide information in that way. So, like, kind of in this comforting way, and that's when they swear fealty to her personally, which is very interesting scene, but that does happen. After those girls leave, however, Swan comes into the tent to talk to Egwene because she is distressed about the hall. The sitters of the hall of this rebel group of the Aes Sedai, led more or less by like two opposing women named Ramonda and Lelaine. Apparently, these two are trying to deal with, well, not these two directly. There's another one that we'll talk about a little bit later, but the Hall is trying to figure out what to do with Elaida, and at this point in time, the Hall wants to denounce Elaida as a Black Aja, and some of the political discussions that are happening here is kind of distressing Swan for one reason or another. So Egwene and Swan leave the tent and they try to talk about it in their own way or whatever. They happen to encounter Gareth Brine. I'm going to continue to call him Brine for the most part, probably because that's habit, even though I think his name might be pronounced Bryn. I'm sorry. It's going to be inconsistent. I might pronounce it both ways throughout this video, and if so, sorry not sorry, I guess. They also encounter Myrelle, another Aes Sedai, who seems to be pretty agitated at this point in time. Bryn there I go, I pronounced it the different way than I said I would. Brine tells Egwene that he has something that he wants to show her directly, so, you know, they're going to mount up and start to go that direction. Egwene, noticing Myrelle here, decides that she's going to have Myrelle come with them for whatever reason. At this point, it's unclear what that reason might be, so she comes along with them. Before this group of four are able to leave, however, Ramonda and Lelaine themselves end up coming up to the group. They arrive to inform Egwene that Delana specifically, and this is kind of where that information I already said earlier, but this is actually when it happens. Delana, another sitter of the Hall, is petitioning to have Elaida denounced as Black Aja. Ramonda and Lelaine here in the scene basically argue with each other about technicalities and some of their own personal interests involving this sort of situation, this complex, tense political situation. Egwene eventually comes to the determination, she's like, I'm not going to do anything about Delana or whatever she wants to do about denouncing Elaida until you guys let me know, like, what you want me to actually say to her. I can't really do anything about it until I know what to do about it. And so she tells them, like, let me know what to do about it and maybe I'll do something about it, kind of thing. And then they all leave. That's basically how that little bit of the scene goes. She's not going to confront Delana for now. But riding with Swan and Myrelle and Brine out wherever it is that Brine wants to show her stuff, it is also discussed at the very end of this chapter some of the possibilities about taking the White Tower from the army's perspective. Of course, while this whole group is traveling, right now they're traveling to Caemlyn, if I'm not mistaken, and along the way, Gareth Brine is gathering people for his army. There's also another army that is like kind of accruing people as well, that's like following behind them to some degree. I forget who specifically that is or where it's from, like the exact details of it. The opposing army isn't really gathering folk quite as quickly as Lord Brine is, but you know, he's gathering people nonetheless. He wants to lay a siege on Tar Valon and on the White Tower entirely when they get to that point, and he wants to be the first person known in history, well, known in the non-secret history, because there's some secret histories in the White Tower specifically that only like the Amerlin and the Keeper and like some other very specific people happen to know anything about. Brian wants to be like the first like known public figure to lay siege and successfully siege Tarvalon and the tower. That's something that he wants to do. He discusses the possibilities for success and stuff like that at the end of this chapter before we move into chapter 12, where Brian gets to actually show Egwene what he wanted to show her before, namely that there are some merchants traveling nearby and some of the army is trading with those merchants. He informs Egwene that there is a rumor amongst those merchants that is downright certain to spread amongst the ranks of this sort of army that he's gathering up, that Rand has basically submitted himself to Elaida. Of course, we the readers know that this is untrue, and these characters can reasonably assume that that's most likely untrue, given that you know, the situation with Elaida. Rand wouldn't just submit himself to her. He might if he was forced to, but we can reasonably assume that he probably wasn't forced to. Maybe this rumor was kind of built from the half-truth that he was captured by some Aes Sedai to be taken to the White Tower before Dumai's Wills happened, of course. And maybe that's kind of where the rumor sparked from. I don't know. That's just speculation on my end. But either way, this rumor is spreading, and Brian is worried about the possibility of that spreading through the ranks, and therefore plenty of the army kind of like defecting to another side or deciding to do things a little bit differently, not be involved quite so directly with the army as a whole, because, well, who wants to fight for the losing side? Because they kind of all assume that laying a siege on Tarvalon, I forget the specifics of everything, but like, just given the kind of political situation of everything going on in the world at this point, it's not necessarily in everybody's best interest to let a rumor go around that Rand may or may not have submitted himself to Elaida. Egwene more or less kind of says that someone is just at that point going to have to announce very soon, before the rumor can really get anywhere or get ahead of itself, that maybe that it's not true, or spread a different rumor combating that or something. I forget the exact detail of it, but there was some of that information in there. I apologize. Either way, upon finishing this little conversation regarding the merchants and the rumor, they decide to head on back. I believe Brian is sent back on his own, if I'm not mistaken, separately. I think. I might be wrong on that, but I feel like I remember that happening. Whether that happens or not, Swan is told to lead the Aes Sedai going back, and Swan kind of takes them a little bit of a different direction rather than going straight back to the camp. And that is because Swan is taking Egwene and Myrelle, who happens to still be with them, to a little breakaway camp thing that Myrelle has going on, because, of course, you may or may not remember this detail. I had forgotten it for a little while, but had remembered it basically right before the reveal happened. Myrelle is the person that Moraine transferred her bond, her warder bond, to Lan Madrigoran to. Myrelle has also helped to save a couple other warders in the past. Of course, when a warder dies, who is bonded to an Aes Sedai, that Aes Sedai has to deal with like some form of unfathomable grief. Apparently, even Swan still has to deal with like surges of this grief secretly and in private, from when her warder died in the usurpation at the White Tower. When she was deposed from it, her warder died in that situation, and that's something that she's had to deal with. Conversely, if a warder lives and his Aes Sedai dies, there's some similar type of grief, some similar type of really devastating impact that occurs from that. When one of these bonds between Aes Sedai and warder breaks, there's some pretty severe psychological affliction that is apparently, caused by it, and that only makes sense to me. As such, Myrelle happens to have been a person to save a couple of warders in the past from this sort of grief, having their bond transferred to her at some point or in some way. She's managed to save some other people. This is apparently a very long, tedious, maybe, but definitely difficult process to be able to save a warder when his Aes Sedai has died. Myrelle has taken a couple bonds in the past, and more specifically now has taken Lan, and in this little like sort of breakaway spot that Swan leads them to, Myrelle determines that, oh, Swan knows that I have Lan, cool. And she kind of like starts freaking out about it. It's a little bit entertaining at that point, but they get to this point, and Lan reveals himself, or rather Muriel is forced to have Lan shown, and to prove that he's still alive and that he's still around. Alongside Muriel, Nisao, I think that might be how her name is pronounced. It might not be Nisao something, a yellow Aja member who specifically focuses on sort of psychological, mental type of health problems, has been aiding Muriel in trying to heal and help Lan, and it's because some particular psychological affliction has kind of come up on Lan, and that's affecting him perhaps deeper than some other broken bonded warders have had before. It's not really entirely clear what's going on here, but this is kind of the situation that Lan finds himself in. And when he's revealed to all of the rest of them, it's more or less revealed that Moraine transferred her bond to Muriel, maybe without Lan's knowledge, which is more or less the same as an Aes Sedai choosing to bond somebody without their permission or without their acceptance of it, which of course is tantamount to the not particularly great act of sexual intercourse that is forced upon somebody, in the word that I'm not going to say on YouTube. That's basically what this event is considered. So Muriel is criticized, and Nisao to some degree is criticized as well, because of Lan kind of being hidden from them, and more specifically because Moraine kind of hid that her bond was transferred to Muriel from Lan. Maybe, potentially. I might be misreading that situation entirely, but that seems like what was going on. Following the aftermath of this, Egwene basically says to him, it's just like, you're supposed to be Nynaeve's warder. I'm going to send you to Nynaeve now because I know where she's at. And through skimming, through, skipping a little bit of time this way, Egwene takes Lan just a few days north of Ebu Dar, tells him just like, hey, yeah, find Nynaeve, and when the bond can be transferred officially from Muriel to Nynaeve, we'll make it happen, but for now, you need to be with her and protect her because that's what you're supposed to do. That's the decision that Egwene makes here. Muriel and Nisao are also made, basically, they're forced to swear fealty to Egwene, kind of the same way that, not the same way that Phaelin and Theodrin were, because they did that voluntarily and rather surprisingly, but these two are made to do it, and this is something that Swan comments on as being particularly unusual for an Amyrlin. No Amyrlin has forced anybody to swear fealty to her, so there's a little bit of unconventional stuff going on with Egwene's residing in the Amyrlin ship, and that's nothing new, of course, but yeah, that is something else that happens in this chapter. Also, Egwene lets Swan know about the attempted blackmailing of Arena and Nicola, because they also happen to be here with Muriel and Nisao, which is kind of interesting. Wonder why they're here. That's kind of strange. And also, why are they here? And specifically regarding the blackmail ship, which they kind of low-key continue trying to do here to Egwene, which is really odd. Again, a bold move. I don't know what the hell's going on with them, but either way, they happen to be here, and as such, Egwene basically lets Swan know following this entire situation. It's just like, oh yeah, by the way, that novice and hunter over there tried to blackmail me this morning, or last night rather, regarding the fact that you had us pretend to be full Aes Sedai to go do some secret task that you couldn't trust anybody else to do. And Swan, in not so subtle terms, basically says, yeah, maybe you should Epstein them or something, because that's a problem. If it were to get out that you as the Amyrlin seat were pretending to be an Aes Sedai at one point or another, that would turn out really bad for you now, wouldn't it? And of course it would. But it is hilarious that she kind of suggests this because Egwene doesn't particularly like that idea. Even so, back in camp, Egwene has some letters waiting for her from some of the sitters of the hall, basically advising her on how she should handle the political situation with the hall and how everything's going on at the moment. The same way that Lelaine and Ramonda have been trying to do with her for a while, just influencing her decisions, trying to make her come to some sort of decision about different things at different points in times regarding Elida and the Black Aja and all this kind of other stuff that's going on. At the end of this scene here, while she's dealing with this tension and kind of uncomfortable, Egwene's having more of this tension headache problem. Halima enters the tent. Yes, important to note, Halima enters the tent, and apparently Halima's kind of been helping Egwene kind of offhand with some of these tensions, these headaches that she's been having, because, well, be kind of hard for the Amerlin to go for healing to any of the other Aes Sedai and be like, hey, yeah, like I'm like suffering mentally, I need healing or something like that because of just how much of a problem and how much this stress is getting to me. It would be kind of a problem to admit to all the Aes Sedai, just like, yeah, your Amerlin is like very constantly stressed to the point of a breaking point all of the time. That'd be kind of a problem, and it would be. But Halima happens to be like kind of helping and healing her in what Egwene kind of perceives or understands as being like a really strange, even like magical kind of way. This like non-understandable way of healing her that doesn't seem to be Saidar, which is the female half of the one power. And that is because I'm presuming that Halima, or Arengar, as the character happens to be in the Forsaken form, is actually using Saidin, you know, the male half of the one power, like they happen to use, and they're healing through that version of the magic, and that's why it doesn't feel like the typical type of healing like what Aes Sedai happen to do for Egwene, but she just doesn't happen to know or like recognize that difference in a way that is like suspicious or anything like that. You never suspect that this very clearly woman is using Saidin for some reason, and like surely this is going to end up blowing up in her face at some point. Like there's going to be a big problem when it is actually revealed to people that like Halima is not who she says she is. That's going to be really interesting to follow. But that is the end of chapter 12, and that makes chapters 8 through 12 all of Egwene's POV. And in fact, I think that's actually going to be where I end this recording for today anyway, because I've already been recording for 50 minutes. Somehow the recording was even longer than yesterday, but thankfully I think it was a lot better this time around, and I hope that you think it was pretty okay too. Jump cut now to chapters 13 through 17, which I'm recording tomorrow. And we're back, and it turns out I lied. It's not the next day that I'm recording this next portion of the video. It's just a few hours later after dinner and editing part of the initial segment of it. But that's okay. We're going to start talking now about chapters 13 through 17. So let's move on with it. Chapter 13 is, if I'm not mistaken, the very first time we've gotten a POV from Aviendha, which was very surprising to me when I came to read the chapter. I wasn't expecting for an Aviendha POV basically at all, let alone at this moment. And I was also expecting for, you know, a little bit of the plot and the story momentum in this portion of the book following what Aviendha does in chapter 13 to last a little bit longer. To be completely honest, I was very, very surprised by this decision, but it was a pretty welcome decision. I enjoyed being able to follow Aviendha's POV for this one chapter that we got to follow it in. Within said chapter, all of the women that make up this part of the plot line, that being Nynaeve and Elaine and Aviendha all together, they sail on this Seafolk ship. They get on board and meet various high-ranking members of the ship. As we kind of got a little bit of from previous entries in the series, the Seafolk have kind of like a windmaster, a technical shipmaster, and various other like high-ranking folk amongst the ship. Ships are kind of like their own form of governmental bodies, probably not the right way to put it, but like there's a sort of political structure to the Seafolk ships. But we get to meet some of the various characters that the women also get to meet in this chapter. There's like the sort of queen, I guess, if you could consider her that, of the Ethain Mier. I don't know if that means that she's like super high ranking among all of these types of peoples or just within a certain subset. Didn't quite get all of the nuance to that particular, you know, portion of it myself, but we got to meet various of these different characters from Aviendha's POV, and also, you know, equally leveled man who kind of accompanies these various Seafolk here. Basically what the chapter entails, however, is just a bunch of bargaining beginning between the Seafolk and these Aes Sedai now here, trying to locate, if not find, the Bowl of the Winds. If, you know, basically acknowledge that it's a thing in the first place is what happens in the chapter. The women, of course, you know, Nynaeve and Elaine want the Bowl of the Winds because that's the task they've been set on achieving, and particularly they've been set on achieving this task before they return to Egwene or any of the rest of the rebel Aes Sedai. They want the Bowl of the Winds, and apparently they're looking for info or help in locating it from the Seafolk. That's basically what this chapter does. Not a whole lot of really important, I guess, information to go off of in this chapter, but it was interesting nonetheless. I enjoyed most particular about the chapter, not just like kind of what happened, because there wasn't a whole lot that actually happened in it. It was being able to see portions of the world, such as sailing on a large body of water, as Avienda, somebody who is an Aiel and can hardly even conceptualize the idea of an ocean, could not fathom the idea of an ocean, essentially. And riding on ships, this and certain other perspectives that she has as a character on the world that are a little bit unique from some of the other characters was interesting, and I enjoyed being able to follow that. Following chapter 13, I kind of look forward to being able to have more Avienda chapters, but that was like the only chapter that actually deals with these characters directly. I was pretty surprised by that. Coming into my reading for the week, I expected most of the rest of this chapter 13 through 17 portion to have a lot more to do with the girls down here in Ebu Dar, but instead, much of the rest of this portion has to do with Matt and things that are happening with Matt. And kind of as I said earlier in the previous segment of this recording, what's been happening with Matt in the book so far has actually been really interesting. There's been some stuff going on that is that I feel like is actually kind of important to a degree, as opposed to a lot of his material in Lord of Chaos, where he was kind of just tangential to other stuff that was going on rather than being any form of driving force himself. Instead, here he's actually discovering things, kind of putting things together, trying to make his way in the world, and trying to do something about his task to bring Elaine, especially Elaine, to Camelin for Rand. So chapter 14 is where this stuff starts with Matt, of course. Matt and a companion. How do you even pronounce his name? Nalishan? Heck, if I even have any idea how to pronounce the name, please tell me how to pronounce his name in the comments below, because I don't want to be butchering that for the rest of the series. There are other names where I don't really care. That one that one bothers me, actually. Reading just in my head while I'm reading the book, I'm like, I have no idea how to pronounce this name, and it's bugging me. And of course, as is the rule from various say veterans of the series, never Google anything that has to do with a character from the Wheel of Time, because you're like as not to get spoilers related to them, even if you were to just look up how to pronounce a name. So please tell me how to pronounce this character's name below, this companion of Matt in chapter 14, attending a horse race, a horse betting race, essentially, because one of their other companions, a boy named Olver, and his horse Wind, have been entered into a horse racing competition, and betting happens on all these horse racing competitions. Apparently Olver and his horse have kind of gone the distance and made a name for themselves, done a lot better than maybe was what was expected, but Matt has been betting on some of these races. Other people have been betting on the races, but with the dynamic of the odds and the likelihood of Wind winning, in despite of the fact that odds have changed and that he's no longer like the favorite pick for this race, Matt still convinces his companion to bet all of the gold that he has on him to put onto Wind winning the race, so basically over winning that race. During the race, Matt notices a dark friend woman somewhere else in the crowd, a person who he feels like he thinks he recognizes but can't really place anywhere, until he does place her somewhere and remembers that she was a woman who had been trying to kill him all the way back in The Eye of the World, the very first book of the series. Just a random memory that came back to him from those various spotty portions of his memory during that time when he had the dagger from Shadar Logoth. He remembers this dark friend woman who admitted to being a dark friend to him and Rand, or Rand, however, trying to kill him back all the way in that book. So following the horse race and it being confirmed that the boy and Wind won the race, Matt orders his companion to make sure that he gets all the gold, and he decides to follow after this dark friend woman whom he recognizes through a large portion of Ebu Dar, the city. So Matt follows her when she goes to a shop, for example, is one of the stops that he ends up at. He has to buy a ring from the shop to be able to keep pursuing her, because he's like kind of pretending to be looking at a ring so as to maybe not quite tip her off. So obviously that he's following her, that he's trying to follow her to any degree. He's unable to unslip a ring off of his finger that he like tries on in this kind of pretending, and so just pays for it really quickly and ends up leaving the shop. He's able to get the ring off at the very last second. However, he kind of sets that in a little pouch of his that he has, and he follows this dark friend lady all the way over to a palace within the city. There are a number of palaces, including some that can be rented out to various peoples. She enters the palace on familiar terms, Matt notices, and something that he wonders and considers about is just like, okay, why would this dark friend be entering this palace? Who's on familiar terms with her? Who owns this palace, or who's living in this palace? Somebody else on the street beside him happens to hear this, and lo and behold, it's some guy who Matt recognizes from also being at the horse race betting. That would be the way to phrase that. And this man who overhears Matt kind of asking this question to himself just kind of reveals that a specific white cloak inquisitor in the area is the one renting the palace, which sets Matt's gears a-turning and thinking, oh yeah, this is probably a dark friend white cloak. That might be a problem. I'm going to go ahead and actually inform Elaine and Nynaeve, as much as they may or may not care about any of this kind of thing, about this problem, because that's kind of dangerous. There's a dark friend that I recognize, and she was accepted rather warmly, all things considered, into the palace of a White Cloak Inquisitor. Pretty suspicious activity. This moves us into chapter 15, in which we shift away briefly from Matt's POV to the POV of Carradine, the White Cloak Inquisitor who happens to be renting out this palace. The woman who entered the palace, I forget her real name. It was put in the book, her real name, but she goes by the name, at least in this sort of persona at the moment, she goes by the name Cheyenne or something like that. Carradine is writing a letter to the Lord Captain Commandant, however, whatever the position is, Pedro Nile, who of course was assassinated back in the prologue, but this Inquisitor probably doesn't know that at this point. Maybe he does, I don't know. Could be subversive stuff going on, but he's writing a letter to Nile when Cheyenne enters, asking for more money because apparently she's a pretty decent assassin and has been hired by Carradine to search around the city, presumably for something like the bowl or maybe the Aes Sedai or something more specifically. It's hard to say for sure what it is she's actually searching for. I think it was more or less suggested in there that she's also searching for the bowl for some reason or another. Although if she's working for this White Cloak and she happens to be an assassin, there's probably some other actually different motivations going on here that I'm not personally getting or immediately understanding off of the top of my head. It could be anything, quite frankly. Carradine, despite her being an assassin, kind of threatens her about the fact that she shouldn't need more money or that much more time to be able to complete whatever task it is that he has set her to do. But he is cut off essentially in the middle of his speech by looking out the window and seeing Matt across the street. Of course, when Matt was watching Cheyenne enter and kind of talking to himself while still looking at the palace out there at the very end of the last chapter. But Carradine recognizes Matt in this instant, and that kind of set my gears turning this time around. There's a reason that Carradine will recognize Matt that I'm not fully seeing at this point, but there's also kind of some other stuff going on with him as well. Within kind of this discussion, this scene, also interrupting the moment, is the Forsaken Samael just kind of happens to enter the place. He just appears and threatens Carradine pretty incessantly, personally, including about fades, and this is an important point, including taunting about fades or Miradral and his family dying in some sort of succession, which feels very familiar to me for some vague reason. Like I said, Carradine has to recognize Matt for a reason, and the familiarity of this sort of threat, this sort of taunting that Samael is doing against Carradine means that we've probably dealt with Carradine before, but something doesn't feel right about the character. I don't think we've actually met Carradine before. If we have and I'm completely forgetting, that's totally an option, but I feel like there's a layer here that Carradine, where we've seen him before, was a different identity or something from previously in the series. It's getting kind of hard to say. I haven't been able to determine that for sure off the top of my head. I'm just kind of having vague inklings. It's like something about this doesn't quite add up. It's not as plain as the chapters making it seem to be, and that feels kind of weird. I don't know exactly why that is or how to resolve that kind of strangeness that I'm feeling with it, but even so, it's interesting to note these details. Maybe it'll be revealed itself into me. I'm sure Jarek will probably watch this video and tell me, oh, you idiot, this was obvious and revealed like 3 books ago in chapter 19, paragraph 54 or something like that. Not that specific, not to be too hard on you, Jarek, but there are definitely some times when I miss seemingly obvious stuff on account of my just being very bad at reading into details on a first-time read with something as big and complex as this series, versus Jarek, who has read the series 13 times, and maybe things that aren't so obvious on a first-time read are very obvious much later. Like I said, maybe there is totally a reveal here that makes sense or that I missed or just don't remember, kind of along the lines of the fact that we saw Moghedien being freed in the epilogue of Lord of Chaos, which I had forgotten. I forget or miss quite a bit of stuff with this series at this point, which is fine, but again, I feel like there's a reason why kind of these references in chapter 15 here are vague and like familiar, but that's basically the line there. Like I said, I feel like there's something. I don't think we've met Caridin specifically. I think we've met him under some different guise or persona in which the threat regarding Myrddraal murdering family members or something along those lines actually happened. But what specifically that was, man, I don't remember for sure. Definitely not enough to really say anything. So that's interesting. Anyway, when Samael leaves after this threatening and after this taunting, Caridin seems to punish Cheyenne in some sort of unclear way at the very end of the chapter. This is also pretty vague. It's kind of hard to tell whether he just straight up kills her or if he just assaults her or something. It's really, really hard to tell. I don't know. Chapter 15 just kind of had a lot of these like vague, like, here's some things that are happening elsewhere in the series, but I'm not going to give you all the details because you got to figure that out. And I'm like, I am not smart enough to figure this out. I'm so sorry, Robert Jordan. But chapter 15 was good. Don't get me wrong. I enjoyed the chapter. It was also short, which was kind of nice and refreshing. Particularly following like chapter 12 or whatever, which was very long. Chapter 15 was good, but there's a lot here, probably a lot of subliminal stuff that I'm not fully understanding, but that's okay. For now, we're going to go back into chapters 16 and 17, in which, 16 and like the first half of chapter 17 are back into Matt's POV. In chapter 16, Matt goes directly to the Terrasen Palace here in Abu Dar. Sorry, I've got like a whisker that's like in my peripheral vision down here that's bothering me, so that's why I'm fiddling with my mustache this whole video. Anyway, Matt goes directly to the Terrasen Palace, which is, the main governmental body of Abu Dar, where the actual queen of the city lives. He goes there to take a message about the Dark Friends, so the woman and presumably Caridin, the owner or renter of the palace, as a White Cloak Dark Friend, wants to take a message about them to Elena and Nynaeve directly. Along the way in the palace, he is stopped within the walls of the palace, more specifically, by nearly all of the rest of the Aes Sedai who happen to be in the palace and in the city in general, which is quite a number of them. I think 3 or so Aes Sedai who are allegedly kind of sided along, party lines of like Nynaeve and Elaine over here. But then there's 2 Aes Sedai who are here, who are sided with Elida, who have been sent here by Elida, or kind of as like a useless task or whatever reason they happen to be here for. Matt's just here with like 5 Aes Sedai surrounding him, who are a lot of political tension in the scene that was pretty entertaining and funny as well. You see Matt kind of breaking the tension here, and also in the earlier chapter that he was in ways that I feel like he hasn't really gotten to yet. A lot of people acknowledge Matt as being like an entertaining, if not funny, character in the series. And up to this point, like up until like these couple chapters, he's mostly not been that character for me so far, but starting to show a little bit of inklings of that, which I've enjoyed. But kind of in this confrontation where Aes Sedai are like politically fighting with each other, and Matt just kind of happens to be in the middle, one of the palace servants finally returns to break up this sort of tension here with a summons from Queen Tylin of the palace queen of Abu Dar and Tyre, summoning Matt to Queen Tylin directly. It's presumed that she decided to go there in order to make it easy to free Matt from this tension. I'm not entirely sure what it is that these townsfolk or what the people in the palace actually feel about the Aes Sedai directly. Anyway, Elida's followers of the Aes Sedai in this moment, one of them who may or may not have been referenced as being one of the sitters of the hall at the White Tower, and if that's the case, why in the world is she all the way down in Abu Dar? I have no idea what's going on there. I don't know if that was a reference I misread or something. It might have been. But either way, Elida's followers of the Aes Sedai here warn Matt pretty directly into his face about who he ties himself into, or who he ties himself up with, rather. So, presumably, don't tie yourself up with these rebel Aes Sedai, or with anybody who they associate with as friends or anything like that. Typical stuff that you might expect from opposing factions, and one of them deciding to relent and let Matt go with the other to some degree. There's a meeting with Queen Tylin directly in this chapter. Matt writes a short little message about the Dark Friends that he wants to give to the girls, since the girls are not currently in the palace at the moment. He also informs Tylin about the Dark Friends and about this issue personally. She kind of gets a little bit close for comfort with him, so there's some underbedded romance attempt here going on, whatever reason Tylin may have for trying to get that way with Matt in this chapter. Who knows? I have no idea at this point, but that's definitely some of the undercurrent that's happening in this chapter, and also in the beginning of the next chapter as well. But to finish off chapter 16, we get to see Tylin's son, Beslin, if that's his name. Beslin is a weird name. It's a little bit too close to embezzling. Anyways, Tylin's son Beslin returns, having lost the horse race, because apparently he was one of the other contenders in the race against presumably Over, and lost the race because Over won. Apparently he also killed one of the other competitors following the race in like some sort of heat of passion or rage, or after some taunting or something along those lines. He seems to feel more bad about having to apologize to the wife of the competitor whom he killed, rather than having killed the competitor entire, which Matt doesn't find particularly comfortable to be around. In the end of the chapter, Matt happens to end up tied to Beslin in the way that Tylin wants him and Beslin to attend dances and other similar types of events in the city now, which of course Matt is not particularly fond of. He doesn't really want to be doing anything for anybody or with anybody whom he does not choose at this point, and he didn't necessarily choose to be doing this. All he wanted was to give a message to the girls. But that moves us into chapter 17, which starts off with a little bit more of Matt's POV, with him returning to his inn, where he happens to be jumped by a couple of strangers, more specifically one of them who comes up behind him when he tries to go up to his own room. This first stranger gets into a scuffle with him. Matt inadvertently kills him as they kind of barge into the room where the other stranger happens to be, opening like an empty chest of sorts. Matt kills him preemptively before he can actually make any move to try to kill Matt first, and the second guy falls into the empty chest. Seems like there might be the suggestion that these guys could have been intending to steal Matt's gold from him, even though it's not quite sure how they would know about how much of the gold that they just won in the horse race a couple chapters back, because, well, it just happened a few hours earlier, but it was also within the past few hours that these people kind of came into the inn under relatively shady circumstances. The innkeeper, she doesn't really care about the fact that these men died or were killed in her place. It's just a matter of what they were actually doing here. She expresses to Matt that they seemed pretty shady, so that's probably some information that is good to know for the future. Matt also, in the aftermath of this event, notices a note in his pocket that is warning of the path in which Nynaeve and Elaine are taking, which seems to have been left in his coach by an unknown person. He suspects it could have been one of Elida's Aes Sedai, for example, but it's really hard to say. He doesn't have an idea quite who it could have been. I have no idea who it could have been either. As for all I know, Jordan's going to reveal in a random one-off scene 2 books from now exactly who it was that left that note in Matt's pocket, and it's going to be some important figure or something like that. Who knows? I have no idea. It could go either way, but that is how that goes. But then we come to the last few scenes of chapter 17, which were pretty short and all a little bit more like questionable in nature, at least questionable in the sense of like, I don't actually know fully what purpose it is they are serving. I don't know what it is they are suggesting. I don't know what it is that they are foreshadowing, but I can't really make heads or tails of all of it quite yet. In the first one of these short POVs, you have Jolene and Teslin, who are the Aes Sedai of Elida's, Elida's faction of Aes Sedai who are in the palace, the two of them that were confronting Matt, for example. I think this section might have actually suggested that one of them had left the note in Matt's pocket. I forget. I might be making that up. I could totally be gaslighting myself into thinking that happened. Either way, the two of these Aes Sedai are arguing to each other about kind of what to say about what's going on in Ebu Dar to Elida, what to say, how much to say, when to say it, all of this kind of stuff. Teslin wants to take Elaine and Nynaeve and Matt, for that matter, to Elida directly, while Jolene is a little bit more wanting to stay silent about whatever's going on down here, whatever reasons these two have for thinking these things. Who knows? We have another short POV after that of a couple of people named, a couple other Aes Sedai named Phalion and Ispen, whom I recognized the name Phalion when I was reading the chapter. When I was reading the scene, it took a little bit for me to remember where or why. That is because Phalion and Ispen are arguing in the scene about the supposed existence of a stash of magical artifacts, or, like Angreal, Ter Angreal, Se Angreal, that kind of stuff. These kinds of things that they could potentially use and find, locate somewhere. They're have been tasked to find these things. Phalion is one of the Black Aja. Both of these two are Black Aja, but Phalion is one of the Aes Sedai who went with Leandrin, was that her name? Several books back when they all left the White Tower. Back when, like Egwene and Elena Nynaeve were tasked with trying to discover more about the Black Aja and confirm that it actually exists and all of that fancy whatnot. So that's why I recognize that name. These two are arguing about the supposed existence of the stash of magic. Halion wants to give Elaine and Nynaeve to Moghedien because they're kind of in this area. They want to kind of jump them and give them to Moghedien directly because they know at this point that Moghedien's like around somewhere. I don't think they know that she was captured, let alone if she's been freed from capture, but they want to capture the two girls and be able to give them to Moghedien as a gift because they know that Nynaeve was the only person at this point to basically defeat Moghedien to any notable degree. And Ispen, on the other hand, wants to kind of stay as far away as possible from the girls and kind of just like keep away from whatever's going on here. So those are a couple of those scenes. And then there's a third, more mysterious scene of a mysterious man watching as a couple of characters called Nad and Arnin, who are servants of Phalion and Ispen. I was reading the scene. I'm just like, wait a minute, didn't I just read those names? Where did those come from? And I had to go back to the previous scene to remember that I had just read those names. That's how quickly names can go in one ear and out the other if they are not immediately relevant to the story. This is a problem that Jordan is definitely starting to have at this point of the series. Too many named characters that don't matter. But maybe these characters do matter. Like I said, there's a mysterious man who is unnamed in this scene watching Nad and Arnin doing some work outside of presumably whatever hut or house or whatever it is that Phalion and Ispen are staying in. It seems like this mysterious man doesn't really remember much about what's going on or who he is or whatever, but he does consider finding Cheyenne and discussing her specifically as like an assassin to do something. He wants to, find her for some reason. No idea what any of that means, but I'm sure I'll find out eventually. But that wraps up chapter 17 and thus the reading that I did this week. It was quite a lot to talk about. I don't want to ramble too much here at the very end just because of how long this video is at this point. It's probably, I don't know, upwards of an hour and a half. It's probably like 70 minutes at this point or something. And that is frankly way too long. So I will thank you guys for watching this video. If there's anything that I have supremely far off the ball here that I should know better about, like some of the things that I've suggested, asked questions about, or been a little bit confused by over the course of the video, clarify some things as you feel is necessary, and more importantly, as isn't a spoiler for me in the comments below. I would appreciate some of that. I enjoyed the reading, but it was definitely a lot. So like I said, I don't think I'm going to try reading another full quarter of the book this weekend. I will instead try to get through just another 10 chapters again for simplicity's sake, which will be about 130 pages. So I'll read chapters 18 through 27 this weekend, and that is where I will come back and talk to you guys in the next diary next week, diary number 40, the third one for the book. And that means that I'll end up splitting the book into being 5 weeks and 5 diaries of reading. I'm looking forward to continuing, that is for sure. But there's actually been a lot going on in this book. How somebody could consider A Crown of Swords to be a slog book is kind of strange to me, because like it's no more sloggy than any of the last few books have been. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 were long, and a couple of them could argue to be a little bit bloated in comparison to the first 3, in my opinion. It's not to say that they wasted a lot of space, but there's a little bit of that in there, especially Lord of Chaos had a couple points where I was like, okay, can we kind of move on with it? A Crown of Swords is moving at no different of a pace and revealing no fewer things, not having any less stuff happening on the page than any of the books of the series at this point. Quite frankly, there's maybe less action in the book so far. A lot of this has been a little bit more expositional, a little bit more transitory in between something as epic as like Dumai's Wells, for example, and moving into a new sort of chapter, a new segment of the series. So like there's not quite as much of that active plotting and pacing mechanisms that you might expect from something that would be considered faster paced than Wheel of Time. But Wheel of Time up to this point has never really been fast paced per se. There are moments that are, and there are moments that I would even say are like rushed. Some of the climaxes are perhaps paced a little bit poorly because they're not spaced out the way that you would expect them to be, given all of the exposition that Robert Jordan tends to do in the books. But what I'm saying is that A Crown of Swords has been no less eventful, been no less impactful than any other book in the series up to this point. I've read about half of the book, and to consider this a slog, it would be just objectively wrong to, well, I mean, if you consider it a slog, that's a personal opinion, of course, but for this to be lumped in with the slog books as if it is notably less eventful, or as if notably less important things happen in it, it's kind of strange to me. A lot of it has been kind of build-up type of stuff, but it's all been enjoyable, and there has been a lot of information. This is the longest Wheel of Time diary by far. I think this is by far the longest reading diary I've ever done in general, and that's just covering 150 pages of the book. I've done diaries where I've covered a couple hundred pages or more of any one of these books. Even like Infinite Jest diaries, I've covered pretty significant portions of some of those books and had them be shorter than this, so evidently there's some stuff to talk about if I'm able to talk for well over an hour about A Crown of Swords in 1 week's worth of reading. So I guess that in and of itself kind of goes to show what the quality of the book is at this point. I've been enjoying it, and I'm looking forward to continuing. Once again, thank you for watching. If you did, I'll be back next week with another diary. For now, I have been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I simply hope to see you there.